we were having this discussion in my hermeneutics class, and the professor brought up Doug Ose's paper. And I said, well, yeah, and it's also pretty clear that Jesus had his own conception of where the fuller sense was to be found. And it's in Luke 24. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and enter into his glory? And then verse 27. The fuller sense. What does Jesus do? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Welcome to the Belfast Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Byler. This week, Danny and I continue our discussions of canonization. We focus specifically on the canonization of the New Testament for these first few parts. And in this episode, we talk about the canonization of the gospel stories. Next week, we move on to talk about the canonization of the apostolic letters. And after that, we have a discussion on canons as such. So please stick around for that one, especially because I found that to be fascinating. It connected some dots that I haven't connected before. And again, harped on the thing I've been saying for weeks now, which is, if this is how it operates in the real world, why would we expect it to be any other way with the Bible if God is truly trying to communicate with us? All that being said, if you like what we're doing here, rate, review, leave us something on iTunes. If I get enough reviews, I might read some of them pre-show. I think that would be really interesting. You can always email us at belfastpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram at the Belfast Podcast, and let us know what you guys think of what we're doing here. As always, we hope to start recapturing the Christian imagination, giving people a better relationship with the Bible, and helping them think about things in a different way. And hopefully it doesn't just affect your head, it affects your heart, and affects your actions. With that being said, thank you guys very much for listening. I hope this one is edifying and fruitful, and we will see you in the next one. We got a really interesting email a few weeks ago, or not a few weeks ago, a few days ago, that was very encouraging and pretty exciting. So I always love hearing from you guys. So if you want to let us know how you've appreciated what we're doing here, or things you think we could do better here, some stuff you feel like might be worthwhile for us to pursue that we maybe aren't at the moment, then feel free to tell us all about that, either in a comment or an email or a DM. For us being a smaller channel, it's always a little bit strange to have someone that I don't know at all in real life email me and tell me that they've been listening to me for months, because that's how we got started.
Yeah.
It is so, I mean, what was your reaction?
My reaction to this past email?
Yeah.
I mean, I read it to my wife, and I told her, I was like, this feels crazy in the best way possible. Right?
Yeah.
Because it's the exact impact that I hope to have on people. Right. And
yeah.
I want this to be a place where people can learn and grow, but also can feel like there's someone else out there who thinks and feels like they do. And that was really what I got from the email that we got. It was also weird because, we met because I sent you an email.
Yeah.
A very similar email, actually. And so it was weird being on the other side of that email, yeah. Which you've said for quite some time, that like this whole thing between us and how it's like grown over the last, I guess it's almost been a year.
Yeah.
Has been crazy because, I at first was referencing you as the guy I listened to online, and now we're friends. And so it's like, it's
now people listen to us online.
Yeah. Now people listen to us online. So it was weird in the best way possible. It was crazy in the best way possible. And it was really touching.
For sure.
Really encouraging. So
it was, and it came on a day when I was like, had a horrible day at work, and it was just crazy stressful, and some weird things happened. And I was just thinking, like, man, I'm standing there at work, like helping close, and I'm like, man, I don't want to be doing this. I really hope that, because we've been behind the scenes talking a lot about ways to help grow and offer more things for the podcast and other related content. And as we've been talking about that, as I was standing there at work after this crazy day thinking about it, I was like, man, I really hope that, the tide starts to turn more in a more profound way for us, so that I can see that the efforts of our labor is paying off.
Yeah.
And I literally got a notification on my phone for the email. And then I read it and I was like, okay. And then I thought, well, okay, if all we ever did was what we currently do now, and I got an email like this every few weeks, that's okay.
Yeah.
Because that's ultimately the goal.
Yeah.
Is that I am able to impact people in that way, and like you said, help give them a community, help give them someone to relate to, and help them, think about the Bible better and have a better relationship with God.
Recapture the Christian imagination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that it was very touching and very encouraging.
Yeah.
So
if you, person who emailed us, are listening, thank you very much.
Yes.
For your words, and to you and everyone else, keep listening, keep sharing, let people know about us and what we're doing.
And if you've been on the fence about, oh, should I reach out? Are they going to say anything? Is it's going to be weird? No, it literally makes our week.
It does. It does.
And I will respond to everyone at this point, at least, because I can respond to everyone who emails me or messages me or comments. So, yeah.
Well, and hit up the Instagram too. It's
we're about to do
revamp.
a revamp. So,
you can wait till we revamp, or you can just, comment on something now, shoot us a DM, whatever.
So introductions out of the way, what we've been covering for the past few months here on the podcast is approaches to the Bible and approaches to literature. In short, our argument has been something like, to understand anything that we read or any act of communication, we have to understand the time and place in which that occurs to better understand what is being said and what is attempted to be communicated there. And once we grasp those, we can then make judgments on how that is to be used in our own lives, as far as advice possibly that the Bible or the story or the thing being said can give, or even what it means in that sense. And so we've been doing that with literature itself, talking about Lewis's frames of literature as a lens through which to view the world, and then see how that lens maps onto the real world, quote unquote. The phrase we've been using is, yeah, but what about the waterfall? From Abolition of Man, which the other chapters in the book are probably also worth visiting at some point in time. So we've made that argument for literature itself. We've been making that argument for film and for fiction, that to understand characters, you have to understand time and place. Even in a fictional world, a good author is going to give you that real sense of what's the word I'm looking for? He's going to entrance you into whatever's happening, right? We use this example with Avengers and Infinity War. Well, you aren't thinking about, oh, that's a guy in a robotic suit and a purple alien and a space wizard who can cast spells. No, this is Iron Man, this is Doctor Strange, this is Thanos. They're after all these gems, and you go along with it because you're entranced, you're in the world. And so In the same way, when we understand the Bible, understanding the time and place in which this communication occurs and the settings of all of this in the text itself and in the surrounding cultures is all going to aid us in interpreting, exegeting, extracting meaning, and then application for all of us, for Christendom, and for our lives. And hopefully in this way, we are giving and recapturing an imagination in Christianity that seems to have been lost, because the text, to use a phrase Daniel's been using, seems very concrete, and in that sense seems very flat. And in Peugeot's words, many people seem to want a past that, a third person neutral interpretation, which forfeits the thing, which forfeits, I said this in the episode we did about inspiration and inerrancy, and I'm going to try and repeat it again because I thought it was good. In that sense of wanting a past that interpretation, you are forfeiting the form in which the thing takes. Because as N.T. Wright says, whenever anybody writes, it's selection and arrangement. There's no other way to write. And so wanting a neutral third person point of view, omniscience point of view, disappears when you put words on paper or images on a screen, or sentences in order or paragraphs in order, or give a speech or a lecture or anything like that. Any form of communication at some level, because of our finite embodiment, frailty, finitude, have to communicate with certain things in mind. This is why Peterson's language about vision and hierarchy and value is so essential. That's a long way to say this is what we've been talking about. How do we understand these things about literature, about vision, about perception, about communication, and use those same things when we come to the Bible? And so we've made a transition recently from keeping all of that in mind into, okay, then how do we, knowing how literature functions and film functions and communication functions, how do we view the inspiration of the Bible? What does that do for our thoughts on the inerrancy or non-inerrancy of the Bible? How does this affect the human and the God hand in the Bible? And Mackie, in our last episode, has been taking us through the canonization of the Old Testament. And today we're going to talk about the canonization of the New Testament. And with all those things in mind about literature, time, place, inspiration, it's all helpful to then look at how the Bible gets made. Not written, but made. Because there is evidence, strong evidence of collection, selection and arrangement. It's all you can do.
It's almost like N.T. Wright picked those words on purpose.
Yeah. So we're just investigating that and seeing how both the divine and the human hand are at play in all of these things. And not denying the spiritual reality, not denying that God is involved, not denying any of this, but trying to take an honest look at these things and say, here's, from all the evidence I can compile at the moment, what I see going on. Here's some ways in which we get it right. Here's some ways in which, in our broader evangelical cultural context, get it wrong. And what do we do about these things?
So, as my thoughts have developed since we've been doing this whole series, just a few maybe similar but slightly different ways of thinking about some of the things you just said, and then we can go ahead and dive in. One of the things that Peterson talks about is, and I think it took me a while to really grasp this postmodern concept, but he talks about how let's go with C.S. Lewis first. C.S. Lewis talks about them making the world transparent, right? You can see through everything. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. You can see through everything, and so there's no substance, right? They see everything as projections of the self onto the outside world. And it's because of that that I think they see the most fundamental part of interaction being power, right? Because if it's all just projection, then everything is ground down to who has the power to make their projection the dominant projection.
Or even in more basic terms, make their projection reality.
Yeah. Because they would say that all reality is malleable, and we can shape it in any way that we want, which I think is also a very humanist, theistic way of looking at the world, right? There is no necessarily world. It's all just malleable, and we get to create the world in our image via the use of power. The opposite side of that is that power doesn't exist, that there is no way of projection, that is not a thing that exists at all. And that makes everything rigid and concrete, like you said, has been the phrase that I've been using, specifically with the Bible, but I think that can apply to everything else as well. This pure scientific rationalist that sees no perspective or projection or interpretation on anything, to the point where it becomes super concrete and we can't really do anything about the way things are. And I think that's also not a very helpful or realistic way of looking at things. And so, yeah, we started in that place of kind of wanting to live in a space between these two extremes that doesn't absolutize either of them, right? We don't make either of them the dominant model, but we recognize the fact that they both have legitimate critiques of the other. And we've been kind of living in this theological medium space, right? Between these two extremes. And I think that's very important, because then when we come to the Bible, as we've been doing over the last few weeks, and as we will be doing over the next few, it should allow us to see the way that these things were written to specific people in specific times and places. And so there is very much a truth that is there and is substantial in some way. But that truth that is substantial in some way also needs to be applied to a very different time and a very different place now. And so there's a bit of relationality and tension there. And so that's the groundwork that we laid. And then since then, we've been going over interpretation in light of that truth, methods of relying on and counteracting or trying to resist spiritual forces. We talked about that with the Holy Spirit, and evil or malicious or lying spirits we talked about. And
we'll have to return to egregores at some point.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that would be a fun conversation to have more directly with the lying spirits that we set up in that episode more recently. But yeah, so then we looked at the Old Testament, and we looked at some of the data and analysis that we can concretely do with those things, with the texts that we have and the ways we can see them diverge. And we explored the way we can actually make arguments about what was more or less likely the original intention of a given author, using the knowledge that we have. So with all of that being the groundwork, we're now going to extend that into the New Testament, see the way that that functions in the New Testament, and then move on from there. Anything else that we need to?
No, I think that's good. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and.
But I think you're right. That tension there, because both of those viewpoints deny a certain level of imagination, which is why I think the phrase we've been trying to use and bring back as we switch perspectives a little bit from deconstruction and reconstruction, which this was even why I know this feels right is because this was even my heart behind that phrase when I started using it. Was this is more or less what I was trying to illuminate. Was let's call it a better third option. There's a lot of things we've lost due to the last 100 years of biblical interpretation, especially in America, that is very sad. So being able to recapture some of the imagination of Christians in the past and current is of, I think, of ultimate value.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that I think is also important to keep in mind is in re-listening to the episode that we did using N.T. Wright as a source on that one, he talked about how a lot of these ways of viewing the Bible are very specific to America, like modern United States, and haven't existed, which is very true. I mean, in my history of Christianity courses, we talked about that a lot, is there's a very broad range of interpretation that has existed throughout the church, and agree in different, towards those perspectives. Some of them, it doesn't matter, right? They existed at some point in time within what was considered to be the church at that time. And there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad in there, right? I'm not going to deny any of that. In fact, I tend to be the one making the argument that a lot of the things that the church has done over the past few hundred years in particular were at best, theological malpractice, and at worst, just straight evil and a complete corruption of Scripture. But at the same time, we have to keep, we have to acknowledge that our perspectives now in this moment don't represent Christianity as a whole. And in fact, haven't represented the predominant perspectives of Christianity throughout history. And that's a very humbling realization. And that's, I think, good. Because, as Ben S. said, we live in the golden age of biblical scholarship. But that also doesn't mean that we're necessarily right. That means we have more information, right, to be able to sharpen ourselves. And I don't think that, I obviously prefer my own perspectives, right? I think that the beliefs that we've been talking about here now in our current time are the correct ones. But I hope that we can continue to sharpen those things and move forward.
Sounds great. Let's jump into the end of the second part of the Mackie talk about the formation of the New Testament, because we talked about the formation of the Old. All right, play this a little bit. Let me hear.
From that unified Hebrew Bible from the 3rd century BCE, I think it's not just more than reasonable. You need to have exceedingly good reasons.
This is good.
To not think
you want me
that.
to back it up?
How you doing?
No, this is fine.
I was going to skip that, so maybe I should. Okay, all right, here we go. All right, I think we're doing good, because the New Testament's shorter, so this won't just take our time. Right? So we get to the New Testament. Fire hose is still spraying right now. So we get to the New Testament, and this is interesting, and it's the fact that I think most Christians don't really know about, is that the Bible that Jesus read was, so this is a Bible study that Jesus had. He's risen from the dead, and I don't know, maybe if you're not a Christian, you find that one hard to buy, okay? But that doesn't matter. What matters is, here's the apostles, and when they remember Jesus talking about the Bible, here's how they remember him talking about it. This is what I told you, Jesus says, while I was with you. Everything must be fulfilled that was written about me in the Torah of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms. Now that's interesting, Because he's referring to a section of the Bible, and then one book of the Bible. But do you remember, where did the book of Psalms come? In the Ketuvim. Going back, there it is. Oh, conveniently. And what name are you going to give that section? It's the junk drawer. It's the default kitchen drawer of the kitchen. It's the twist ties, Ecclesiastes, and the batteries, Song of Songs like it. So he calls it by the first book of that third section of the Bible. So to me, it's just, okay, there you go. Jesus grew up and was immersed in the writings of the Tanakh. That was his Bible. That's the Bible that he was referring to when he said that I didn't come to set aside the ancient scriptures. I came to fulfill them. When he said, love God and love your neighbor, the Torah and the prophets, everything hangs. Its essence is all right there. So here's where we go in terms of where the New Testament comes from. And this is going to sound familiar, and because it's very similar. It's a very similar story. You have the risen Jesus who's forming a new covenant people who are being transformed by who he is and what he's doing for them. And they're the people that he believes who are going to be able to fulfill the terms of the covenant. Not because they're so great, but because he's here to do it on their behalf. And so he does that in his life and in his death and in his resurrection. His last words to his closest circle of 11 disciples at the end of the Gospel of Matthew read like this. And then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples, invite everybody from planet Earth, right? Everybody into this new covenant family to acknowledge who I am and what I've done for them. Baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, so bring them into the covenant family, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. So just stop and think about that. Just remember our first couple points. Why did the Bible come into existence? To tell the story of what God has done to rescue and redeem a people, and then to invite those people into a covenant relationship and to live by the terms of the covenant. Right? So what is the Gospel of Matthew? It's telling the story of what God has done to save and redeem a people through Jesus of Nazareth. And then it contains all of these teachings of Jesus. And Jesus says, yes, exactly. If you want to follow me and become a part of this family, then you will live by my teachings. And that's exactly what he's commissioning them to do right here. Are you with me here? So right here is the origins of the New Testament, right? The meaning of the New Testament. It's just being formed in terms of the history of events, but the meaning is right there, and it's just a continuation of what the meaning of what the Bible already was in the first place. Are you with me? Okay, so
So I think it's important to establish, just really quick, this is something that a lot of people, at least a lot of people that I've encountered, tend to not really realize, and I think it's just because they don't think about it. But the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was Jesus and Peter and Paul's Bible, right? They didn't have the New Testament. They wrote the New Testament or contributed to the writing. They acted out the events that then got written down later that became the New Testament. And so when Paul in, I think it's 2 Timothy, talks about how all scripture is God-breathed, right? That guy in the Ben S video who was debating inspiring philosophy was talking about, he used that verse and he kept throwing it up there. And what he's not realizing is even if he wants to take that verse the way that he means it, it doesn't include the New Testament, right? At least chronologically speaking, right? You can retroactively imagine that back in because later those things were declared scripture by the Christian church. But Paul isn't meaning likely. I do think Paul thinks that a significant portion of his writings are quote unquote inspired. But then there are also sections of specifically, I think, the Timothy letters where he says, this is not inspired. This is just my
opinion. This is what I think.
This is my advice to you, Timothy, as my disciple. Like, this is me just caring for you. Right. I think there are good things to learn from those sections too. But if what we consider to be inspired and authoritative in canon, even in that, like it's super funny. It's a paradox, right? Because if it's inspired and if it's canon, if it's true, it's saying that it's not from inspired by God and a God command makes it not. But it's like a weird loop, right? If Paul is saying in an inspired text that this section of it is not inspired, if that's true, then it creates this weird loop. And that can be something that makes people uncomfortable. I don't think it's supposed to, but it does raise questions about how we should treat this thing. And we need to think intentionally about how we treat this thing, right? So anyway, I wanted to make that point because he makes it and then kind of moves on. But I think it's a really important realization to make, is that when we're talking about, and when the writers of the New Testament were talking about inspired or authoritative texts, they weren't necessarily referencing their own writings, even though we would consider them to be all of these words that we've been having conversations with over the next few weeks. So anyway, I don't know if you have anything to
add. The only thing I would add is just to reemphasize the point he made at the end there, that the New Testament, while it is new in terms of chronology and history, newer, it's not like the major themes have changed. They're all the same. And what do you say? Inviting people in to the family, to be covenant keepers, into a new way of living. Well, that was Israel. That was what they were supposed to be, a light to the nations, through whom will come all salvation for all the nations. It's what we see in the story of Job. It's what we see in Jesus. And Jesus, so I'll say this quickly because I think, and I'll probably reemphasize it again at the beginning, but I think it's important to keep in mind this, Daniel, as you write down things for the future. This might be worth its own episode. So Doug Ose, who's a graduate from the school I attend, he published a paper not that long ago. And when I say not that long ago, I mean like in the 80s. So it's been a while, but in terms of other things referenced, it's not that long ago. But he wrote a paper, and it's called Canon as Context, the Function of Sensus Plenior and Evangelical Hermeneutics. And what he means by that in sensus plenior, the fuller sense, the truer sense of the text. In this case, we're talking about the Bible. And it's clear from that passage, well, not the passage Tim just referenced, but it's in Luke 24.
He referenced Luke 24 too, I think, briefly.
Yeah. We were having this discussion in my hermeneutics class, and the professor brought up Doug Ose's paper. And I said, well, yeah, and it's also pretty clear that Jesus had his own conception of where the fuller sense was to be found. And it's in Luke 24. And I find this interaction very humorous. Now this is starting in verse 13. Now, the same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along them, but they were kept from recognizing him. It's so interesting. He asked them, "What are you discussing?" together as you walk? And they stood still, their face downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened?" What things? Explain it to me, Jesus asked. And then he says, about Jesus of Nazareth, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. That's a phrase worth asking some questions about. In addition, some of the women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Later, jumping down, Jesus, he says to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe. All the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then verse 27. The fuller sense. What does Jesus do? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And I love this. And they approached the village to which they were going. Jesus continued as if he was going further, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is not nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went to stay with them. Oh, you know what, guys? I'm just going to keep going after I've explained all this to you. No, please stay. Jesus is funny. He's very funny. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were our hearts not burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Two things. One side comment. I find it very interesting that they don't recognize him until he does the thing he did on the night he was betrayed to institute the new covenant.
Yeah.
This should show us the power and the sacredness of the Eucharist. And then the other thing was back to the point I was making about the fuller sense. Jesus seems to think that the fuller sense is the thing that Tim's talking about, the continuation and fulfillment of the story. And there's different ways you can load that word fulfillment, which are worth a discussion. But the point being, and I think the point Doug Ost makes pretty well as well, is that in that there's a sense in which the fuller, the filled to the brim understanding is to be found in the canon, because that's where you get all of these passages, as we've been alluding to and we'll talk about later, talking with each other and even changing what things mean here and there and reinterpreting. We had these examples of John in Revelation, interpreting what things mean here as opposed to there, using phrases from this to illuminate that thing. And I think if we don't have that kind of vision of the unification of those two things, of the continued story that is the same in the Old and the New Testament, we miss that fuller sense, the sensus plenior. We miss what Jesus himself testifies to about how we are to understand the Old and the New Testament in terms of his teaching and his actions. Because as we've said before, and we've made pretty explicit, there are ways in which Jesus not only says but acts as characters in the Old Testament. We had a whole episode on Jonah. There's ways in which he acts as Israel itself. Right? Why does he pick 12 disciples? Why doesn't he pick 11 and he's the 12th? Well, because he's over Israel.
Well, and in Matthew, he goes to Egypt and is fleeing from someone who is killing infants.
Mm-hmm.
He comes out of Egypt. And then the very next thing that happens in the story is he passes through the waters of baptism, passes through waters, enters
The desert
enters the desert
for
for
40
40
days.
days and 40 nights, fasts. So not only is he embodying Israel there, but he's also embodying Moses on Mount Sinai, who's in the presence of God and fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. And so there's this really interesting way. I mean, I've been reading Richard Hayes' Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels. And I'm in the chapter on Matthew right now. And he's talking about all this stuff. Like Jesus is acting out the story of Israel. He's acting out aspects of being the quote unquote Messiah. He's acting out aspects of being the son of David in like the Davidic king to come. Like he's play acting the Bible. He's embodying the Bible, his Bible, in himself. And he's referencing the Bible in speech in very unique and interesting ways. And so, yeah, it's very profound and very complex.
So, yeah, no, I fully agree. I bring all that up because I think maybe Doug O's papers, maybe not worth a whole episode, but worth some more investigation, maybe even just on my part. But
well, I made a note, and I know where we can tie it in, so we'll talk about that later.
But I am fully convinced now that I would always argue that it's probably tougher for us to understand the Old Testament than the New Testament, just because of the gap in history that we have and culture. Right? There's certain things about Greek and Roman culture that Paul references, even in Romans. This is why you have the whole theology bros reform side leaning so heavy on that book. Maybe one of the reasons I would say is because it is so transferable to our current understanding.
You think it is?
Yes, we think it is, because he's drawing on all these allusions that mean something to us that maybe not be what he actually intends. But because the words are similar, we whole transfer meaning onto them, right? But we have less cultural transference we can make about things in the Old Testament. That is to say, without doing the hard work to understand the Old Testament, I think first and foremost in its own place, then can we connect it to the New Testament. Now there are ways in which the New Testament authors, speaking of Matthew, talk about Jesus that you'd fail a hermeneutics class to do, right? Out of Egypt I called my son. Well, Hosea is not even referencing a prophecy. He's calling the nation to remember what happened for Israel in the Exodus. And Matthew quotes it as if it's prophecy about Jesus himself. So,
well, I think Richard Hayes would also make this, and this might be worth looking at too, is I think that's how we think Matthew meant it.
Yeah.
I don't think that's actually what Matthew meant. And it's interesting. But I'd
meaning that Matthew's drawing on the embodiment of Jesus for the story of Israel, not necessarily saying that Hosea was in some way doing a double prophecy about the Messiah and then calling Israel to remember what happened.
Well, that and the surrounding texts of that quotation have a lot of meaning that if taken and imported into Matthew's setting that he's building, reverberate a lot of themes across the span of Matthew itself, the Gospel of Matthew itself.
Yeah.
And so, and later when we talk about intertextuality,
we have a whole episode planned about intertextuality, New and Old Testament.
Yeah.
So look forward to that.
Yeah. And we might not use that example specifically, but the same principle applies. Look at the Old Testament passage and try to understand it on its own face. And then assume that it's keeping that meaning when it's being quoted in the New Testament, and see how that meaning grafts onto what's going on in the New Testament. And when you do that, it should line up with the gospel story that's being presented in some way, shape, or form. And it might change the way you read the gospel or the letter or whatever, but it should graft on rather nicely. Intertextuality is something that I love and something that I plan on studying, hopefully a lot deeper. But anyway, there's a lot more work to do there. So shall we keep moving?
Yeah, I'm just playing with some ideas when we get to that episode about using film intertextuality as a parallel conversation, but
Yeah.
I'd have to find some good resources on that.
Yeah. Well, the classic example we've used here, I'll go ahead and get this up. The classic example that we've used in the past is, of course, Into the Spider-Verse. Sorry, No Way Home.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, there's a ton of.
I'm even talking about how specific shots are repurposed by other directors.
Yes. Yeah.
In different context, but still illuminate the same
thing.
Because the image is the same, you are meant to draw back to, and maybe a good example for this would be ways in which animation does this for references. But that's something I need to ponder. Go ahead.
Okay.
We just really have two sections to go at in terms of how the New Testament comes into existence. The first main section of the New Testament, it's 4 biographies of Jesus. And lucky for us, the third one, in terms of the order of your Bibles, Luke, he has a little note at the beginning to say, hey, dear reader, hi, it's me. I wrote this, and here's why I wrote this. Here's what I want you to, in fact, here's the process that I went through to bring this book into existence. And here's what he says. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. That's a way of referring to Jesus and the story about him as fulfilling the storyline of history and of the scriptures. Just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses, the last S should be yellow, and servants of the word. Now, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. That in Greek, that's one sentence. Yeah, look in English, you had to cut it up. But in Greek, that is one beautiful literary sentence. Okay, so what is Luke telling us here? First of all, do other accounts of the story of Jesus exist by the time Luke starts doing his work? Yeah, they do. We know what one of them was because he used it as a source. It's called the Gospel according to Mark. And he says, just where did we get these accounts? The accounts that he's going to pay attention to and that he's going to incorporate as source material into his account of Jesus, where do these come from? So they were handed down to us. And here he uses a technical term, pardidomi in Greek. It's the work of professional keepers and passers-on of oral or written tradition, scribes and oral historians. And who are these people who are the keepers? He calls them the servants of the word. Who are these people? What does he call them? The people who were there. Do you see this here? So he's like, okay, the Gospel of Mark, which is rooted in the eyewitness memories of Peter, and there's indications within Mark that give us clues of that, and that's actually what was remembered 100 years after it and said about the Gospel of Mark by the early church scholars. So he uses the eyewitness testimony of Peter, written down by John Mark. That's one of his sources. But then he's like, yeah, I went to work. Everybody's still alive. So I went to work like investigating everybody. And I put it all together here for an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now, who's that? That's the $1 million.
Selection and arrangement. It's the only way to write. I listened to the episode yesterday, and I'm gonna keep beating us over the head with that phrase just because I think it is so important. Because there's no other way to do any kind of communication than selection and arrangement. And this is what Luke does. He says, okay, there's a lot of stuff out there about Jesus. A lot of people have been trying to write it down. A lot of people have been talking about it. Mark even wrote his own story about it. And by the way, this is the way that I don't subscribe to the Q theory, just because we can debate about that if you want to.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you.
But I think it's way more logical and easier. Occam's razor would say, no, it's probably more likely that Luke is using Mark as a source. That's why there's copy paste sections in both Gospels.
Yeah. So do you want to explain Q theory just like briefly?
So, and if I miss any holes, you can putty them over. But basically, and Marty subscribes to Q3, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I don't really know why, but
anyway, part of it has to do with when you think the authorship of these certain books happened. One of the proposed solutions to why there are sections in Luke and in Mark that are exactly the same
in Matthew
is that you have what would be then a fourth source, an extra biblical source then that had a lot of that had, let's say, a compilation or a bibliography of sorts of things that Jesus said and did, stories of that each of these gospel writers copy from to use to select, then arrange where they want them in their stories. And while I guess it's possible, one of the things that makes me not believe it is we've never really found it. There isn't,
or a
my
reference
knowledge,
to it.
any evidence of a extra source. None of them. You could take Luke's opening reference as some reference to something like this, but it's not very explicit, and we don't get anything else like it in any of the Gospels. So
I have a few things on that. In the Bama episode for the Gospel of Luke, which I thought was very fascinating, Marty references a work that I have not read in full. I've only read, I believe, a small section of it. But it talks about the term orderly account, meaning
maybe there were accounts that didn't have order.
Well, having something to do with the parasha readings. And there's a not very popular theory about the Gospel of Luke that I actually find pretty compelling, and I'll have to do some more research into it someday. But it's the theory that it's meant to be a parasha companion. And parasha readings is how the Jews traditionally broke up the readings of Torah. And so you'd read through all of Torah in a year, and every week at synagogue, you'd read a certain section. And there's a theory that Luke is written to have certain sections that correspond to those sections of Torah that walk through the life of Jesus as you walk through the traditional Torah parasha readings. I think that's rather fascinating. And so the source talks, Marty's source talks about the words for orderly account that are used at the beginning of Luke, potentially having reference to this. They also, and Tim mentioned this, the term handed down refers to scribes or professional oral tradition memorizers having parts of this themselves. And so I don't think Q, a mythological source that we've never found any evidence for, exists. I think what's likely the case is that these professional oral tradition keepers and scribes probably had records of things Jesus did in their villages.
Mm-hmm.
And Luke went around and just asked these people, hey, what happened here with Jesus? And he takes all of these and he arranges them into parasha portions. He selects and then arranges these stories in a way that helps demonstrate the way Jesus kind of walks through Torah, which I think is a very compelling, and I haven't looked into this enough to say that it's the view that I necessarily hold, but I at least find it to be a very compelling view. And the idea of using Mark as a source is a very common. So you have the three synoptic gospels, right? Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the idea is,
oh, what's his name? Sorry.
no. While you're looking that up,
no, that's not what I want.
the theory is that Mark is the source because Mark is the shortest, the most, the quickest as far as pacing goes, and there are several other indications that Mark is probably the first for theological and other reasons. Though I think that's kind of being weakened now with some of the intertextual conversations. Anyway,
this is what I was trying to get at. Have you read Bockham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses?
No, I haven't.
Okay, because he makes a very strong case for Luke borrowing from Mark.
Yeah. Well, anyone who says that Matthew and Luke aren't borrowing from Mark probably hasn't really seriously studied it. I mean, I plan on one day, for just professional reasons, I'll probably need to for professional reasons, buying a synopsis, which is literally all four gospels set side by side. And you can literally read, like, it looks as though Matthew and Luke literally copy and pasted sections of Mark, like using a copy and paste function on a computer, kind of accurate, right? This was part of my text analysis that I did for my New Testament class in the fall semester, and we'll actually cover part of that in an upcoming episode. That we had to look at the section, our particular section of Matthew and Mark, and look at the way that they paralleled each other. And there are literal lines that are copy and paste from them. And so the idea that at least one of the gospels was not a source for the other gospels is just, there's no evidence for that. In fact, all the evidence is to the contrary. And so, yeah, I don't really know what else to say other than it's highly unlikely, almost without a doubt, Luke and Matthew used Mark as a source. And the reason we chose Mark is complicated, but it's also that it's the shortest, and it looks as though Matthew and Luke both used it, rearranged sections, and also added things, right? There are usually additions that are made, not subtractions. And you would expect additions to the source material. You wouldn't expect necessarily subtractions to be the most common, is the part of the thought process there. So
I don't have anything else to add. I just wanted to bring that up, that here again, we just see you can't get past the form of the thing. It is selection and arrangement. It's how we communicate. It's how we write.
Yeah.
And I don't see any of what you've just laid out as a evidence for distrust in the gospel narratives.
No.
Matter of fact, I see it as confirming their reliability. And even just the nature of, this is something my dad has brought up a number of times, and I think it's a question worth pondering. Why? If, in fact, the followers of, this is more of an apologetic approach, but if, in fact, the followers of Jesus were this renegade, rebel sect of Judaism, why does what we have post-resurrection, an explosion of text trying to figure out who Jesus was and what he meant? Why don't we have an explosion of text about people trying to dissuade the small minority from spreading falsehood about him? Because apparently there was a lot of people that didn't like Jesus. So it's just a question worth asking, because you would think that the logical thing to happen would be, if he's truly, to use Lewis's trifold, liar, lunatic, or Lord, if he's really just a lunatic,
Yeah.
none of it ever should have taken off.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
None of it. Matter of fact, you would have probably had a large majority of people being like, no, you're actually wrong. And, you know,
Well, and
not to
and
say that those times of things don't exist, because you certainly have them in Gnostic gospels that come later,
yeah.
but we don't have much of anything of the same hundreds of years before Gnosticism is even concretely organized as a system of religion, let's say.
Yeah.
But we don't have much of anything from the first 200 years of, and let's say, anti-Jesus propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also think it's interesting that, I mean, and I think Tim says this later, but it sounds crazy, right? That, like, we don't encounter resurrection of the dead in our everyday lives. So the idea that this idea would become super popular, I don't know, like, there are certain degrees of, like, I can kind of see how it's compelling to a degree, right? Like, you know, but on the other hand, it does seem like kind of a ridiculous proposal.
It is ridiculous.
So it's like, I feel like there's got to be something there, you know. But and we should probably keep moving.
Yeah, keep going.
My battery's draining.
Question, right? Why, to have a biblical book dedicated to you, what does that cost? And we're not far from the truth, probably, because most likely, this is one theory. I think it's the most probable. There are other theories out there. This is a common thing that authors would do: dedicate the book to the patron who paid for the research leave, so they could do the hard scholarly work of research. Are you with me here? So there are other views out there, but I think that's the most compelling. And what he wants to do is to Theophilus and to the church at large, so that they can have even more certainty about the things that they've already been taught about Jesus. So here's my way of drawing this. Note takers, you'll like this. This is so here we go. This is my silly way of thinking about how the Gospels came into existence. The picture right there, this is interesting. About 5 years ago, there was a group of British archaeologists, and they worked in the field of Jewish archaeology and so on in the Holy Land. And what they did, these 3D scans of every Jewish male skull found from tombs and so on, that dates to the time period, and they created a general portrait of the average Jewish man living in the time of Jesus. And there it is. That's it. You can Google it. It's really interesting. So I don't know. Is it Jesus? No. Could it be what Jesus looked like? Absolutely. I mean, that's actually the best crack we have at it, not the stained glass windows. So, or European movie stars or whatever. So there you go. So that's Jesus. So here's Jesus, right? The years and the years that he lived, he's there speaking, teaching, doing healing, talking, all that. And then you have the 4 accounts, each of which is linked, as we'll explore in a couple minutes, to one of those apostles who is a part of that circle that Jesus deputized and commissioned to spread the story and his teachings to all of the nations. So, but we've got a gap of a few decades in between those two. Are you with me? So that gap in popular imagination gets filled with what you used to do at your junior high sleepovers, right? With your friends, which is like you would say some telephone game. You guys with me? So you would whisper, whatever, 10 little elves, go to the market and get some milk or something like that. I just made that up. So you whisper that into a friend's ear, and then your friend whispers that. You guys know the game? You know what I'm talking about here. And then it's comes back and it's 10 elephants, go buy popcorn or something like that. So And are you guys with me? Many think like, oh yeah, they were just telling campfire stories of Jesus and they were doing this. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. First of all, their brains weren't melted by Twitter and TV, all right? And second of all, we know like the events of Jesus, whatever happened with Jesus, these were clearly absolutely life-shattering, transforming experiences that people had with this man. And you're telling me that they're going to tell and retell among circles of people who, they were all there, they all saw and heard what happened, and in the span of the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, those are going to get so overcooked that there's no legitimate, authentic, historical trace of what Jesus said or did in these four Gospels. You have to be unreasonably skeptical to come to that conclusion, in my opinion. There are really smart people who disagree with me, but I disagree with them. And I don't know what to say about that. I just, let's not be silly. Anyway, so here's.
So just a quick note on that. I also think that it's really fascinating. Yes, there's a large gap between the events that occurred and the writing of the Gospels. But you have the letters of Paul that somewhat bridge the gap. There are writings that occur in that time. And then there's the scholarly question of, well, how much did the writings of Paul influence or persuade the gospel writers? I don't necessarily think that that's much of a concern at all, personally, because I think that I tend to think that that's more of a pessimistic perspective that is almost too critical. Mainly, I would say, because we can see the way that Jesus is very much engaged in his own very Jewish context, and we can come up with very well-informed reasons for why a Jew in the position of Jesus would do and say the things that he did and said, apart from the influence of Paul in any way. I also think that this idea that what people saw as a very profound impact on their lives would then become telephone gamed, right?
Yeah.
Beyond the point of truth, right? To the point of fabrication. Now, I'm not saying that they necessarily experienced things correctly, right? That's a whole nother thing to try and prove. But I think what they express as eyewitnesses is what they firmly believe happened, without any corruption or whatever, right? And Luke's assertion that these were eyewitnesses also eliminates the idea that it's one person telling another person, telling another person, telling another person, telling the story to someone who's writing it down.
Mm-hmm.
There's also that at play here too. And so, yeah, I don't think that it's a really good, well-substantiated critique. In fact, I think it's quite lazy, if I'm being honest.
Also,
Right.
none of us treat stories in our family history that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there might be a little mythologizing going on of things that great grandma, great grandpa said or did. Maybe not. But the essence of the thing typically remains true. And it's not even how we tell our own stories, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm drawing themes and ideas and I'm motifing what happens, right? This is also how you tell a good joke, right? So yeah, it's just, again, it seems to also totally lack any kind of contemplation on how we pass down stories in general, and assumes that everyone who tells a story, again, to go back to your reference in the beginning of the episode, everyone who tells a story is somehow ruled by a will to power.
Yeah.
and their manipulation of the story is going to put them in a position of power. I'm not saying people don't do that. That certainly happens. But to say that everyone that ever talked to Mark or Luke or Matthew was in that position is fairly insane.
Yeah, and oh shoot, I had a thought. I think that darn, what was it? I don't know. It'll come back to me, I guess. Are you ready to move forward?
Mhm.
There's a simple way of depicting how these books came into existence, and to think of them like quilts. That's a picture of a quilt that my wife has. It was a gift to her from her grandmother a number of years ago, and it's in the plastic bag. That's why it's all still nice and clean and so on. But her grandma made this decades ago. The pieces of this quilt come from her grandma's whole lifetime. Some of these pieces of this quilt were given to her by her mom. Some of the pieces of this quilt were things that she acquired throughout the decades and so on. And so my wife, obviously, it's a very special quilt and so on. And so there you go. It hangs on the wall in her bedroom. Now, you look at the quilt and just take 2 seconds of thought. Even people like us, whose brains are melted, right, by Twitter and TV. Is the age of the quilt the same as the age of the pieces that went into the making of the quilt? No. Are you with me? Did you get it? Yeah. Do I need to say any more about the making of the Gospels? So that's exactly what, you guys, this 30-ish year gap, it's not a big deal. Like this is the light within, that's interesting. Yeah, so I'm not sure what happened there. But you guys see how the spelling got funny? Anyway, so so the events of Jesus by these apostolic eyewitnesses, they're remembered, they're told and retold and retold. It's like this, like my wife and I, we've been married 15 years, and we now have a fixed form. When someone asks us, how did you guys meet? How many times have we told that story in 15 years? We've told it dozens of times. So it's kind of like we each know our parts too. Well, I was in the library. We met in a library. Oh, you guys, we met in a library. No, our first conversation was about whether she should sign up for ancient Greek classes. I'm not joking you. There you go. So, there you go. So we've told that story so many times. You know what I mean? It's taken on a fixed form. We've abbreviated it, right? There have been all kinds of things we've done to condense it and to shape it so that we can tell it in a few minutes and not bore the people who ask us or whatever. But
here's another point. So we actually made this point last time, but to build on this a little bit, and he keeps referencing how our minds are like turned to mush because of Twitter and TV and things like that, which is kind of a joke, but I think he's also kind of serious. And I also think that joke represents something that is actually real. These people lived in an oral culture primarily, right? Even if you're more on the side of the spectrum that says that there was far more literacy than we've previously given credit, which I think is actually a perspective that seems to be taking on ground in more recent scholarship. Even if you're in that camp, it was still primarily an oral culture. And there is substantial scholarship that I've been exposed to, even going back to undergrad. And I need to do some more looking into this in depth, but there is substantial scholarship that supports the idea that these oral cultures had better memory retention than we do, because everything that they did, I mean, St. Augustine and the early church fathers, they would memorize whole speeches from like the Iliad and the Odyssey, whole sections of Homeric epic, as if it was nothing, right? I mean, it took them time, but that's what they did. That was a part of being a professional speaker, orator, scribe, or whatever in an oral culture was memorizing massive chunks of text or of epic or narrative or poetry or things like that perfectly. And so this idea that they had the same limitations then that we have now is also not really accurate, because their society functioned and trained them in a different way in regards to memory than ours does. So I think that's another thing to, and he brings that up a bit more in a different version of the top of this talk. So I would highly recommend everyone go out and listen to this talk multiple times. There are multiple versions of it out, so maybe listen to each version once, because we're only skimming the surface of it anyway. But anyway, did you have anything you wanted to say on that?
I was trying to find the clip, but I'll just say it. So McGrath testifies to this in his biography of Lewis, and he talks about how Lewis used to, when he was a tutor at Cambridge, he'd play this game with his students, and he had his bookshelves behind his desk that were full of Greek literature, mythology, things of that nature. And he would turn his back to his desk, have a student pull a book off the bookshelf and read him a quote. And he could tell them the context of the quote and the book in which it came from.
Yeah.
And I've played this game with a pastor of mine where he said, okay, read me any phrase, any verse from a book in the New Testament. We read him a verse. He could tell you, at the very least, what book it was from. He could probably tell you the chapter and roughly tell you the context. So don't tell me that people can't remember things.
Yeah.
As
especially important things.
No, and here's the thing. I think I will take Tim's point where our brains are melted by Twitter and TV, but I will also use a analogy or a parallel that where Bell uses in one of his old sermons. He talks about how, in once schooling and synagogues were set up, how young children, especially young men, would memorize all of Torah. And he said, yeah, we don't memorize like that anymore, at least not in book form, but, ask your kid about the new Eminem album. Right?
Yeah.
Or ask someone about a scene from The Office. We just memorize different things because we think different things are important.
Yeah.
So, yes, in a lot of senses, and in a lot of ways, our attention spans are shorter. Our retention of things is not as good. But and again, why do we memorize those things? Well, because we repeat them over and over and over and over again. I can even now quote almost all of the Incredibles movie because I watched it so much when I was a child.
Yeah.
That's just the power of repetition. We just don't, like we've said before, we just don't have that kind of repetition with the Bible usually. So we don't remember them like we do, or like we should, possibly. But just to make the point, yes, we still can memorize things. We just memorize different things because we think different things are important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in talking about intertextuality, right? Bethany and I have this weird form of intertextuality where we'll reference like obscure vines or memes or things like that. And she and I can have a whole conversation using these obscure references that no one else can understand because we've one, been around each other enough and used them frequently enough to understand, but
Yeah.
also we've been just engrossed in that aspect of culture, right? That's a parallel to what's happening with Jesus and his disciples in their culture, except the thing that they're engrossed in is the Hebrew Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're able to have these same kinds of conversations, just with something substantially more meaningful.
Yeah.
Right. But because we haven't, and we don't have that ourselves, we don't expect them to be having it. And so when they are, we totally miss it.
Yeah.
Which is a shame.
Or again, like we've talked about before, listen to anybody who knows anything about comics or Marvel
Yeah.
talk about the intertextuality within Marvel. I mean, I referenced it. Did you see the Oscorp logo in the new oh gosh, what was it? The vampire movie. Now I'm missing my own joke. Morbius. Did you see the Oscorp logo in the new Morbius trailer? Did you realize that there was this thing in the background? And did you see I almost said Kiefer Sutherland.
Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton.
Yeah.
You know, in the trailer, he has the post credits, like, dude, it's all over. It's just different things.
Yeah. Yeah.